Ludwig Joseph Johann Wittgenstein was born in 1889 and died in 1951, 3 days after turning 62. He was an Austrian-born British philosopher who became one of the most influential and charismatic figures in British philosophy last century. He was born in Vienna into a wealthy and cultivated family, the son of an industrialist. He was educated at home until the age of 14, then at an Austrian school for 3 years. He went on to study mechanical engineering at Berlin, 1906 to 1908, and at Manchester, 1908 to 1911, where he did research on aeronautics and designed a reaction jet propeller. He became seriously interested in mathematics and then in the foundations of mathematics, and in 1911 abandoned his engineering research and moved to Cambridge to study mathematical logic under Bertrand Russell. During 1912 and 1913, he studied with enormous intensity, and Russell said admiringly that he, quote, soon knew all that I had to teach, quote. Wittgenstein served in World War I in the Austrian army as an artillery officer and was taken prisoner on the Italian front in 1918. Throughout the war, he had continued to work on problems in logic, carrying his notebooks round with him in his rucksack. And in the POW camp near Monte Cassino, he completed his first work, the only one published in his lifetime, and sent it to Russell in England. It was eventually published in 1921 under the title Logische Philosophische Abhandlung, and then in 1922 with a parallel German-English text and an introduction from Russell as Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. This was a novel, rather startling work, consisting of a series of numbered, aphoristic remarks centered on the nature and limits of language. Meaningful language, he conceived, must consist in propositions or combinations of propositions that are pictures of the facts of which the world is composed. On this criterion, we must discard as literally meaningless a lot of our conventional discourse, including judgments of value and many of the claims of speculative philosophy. And since the limits of language are also the limits of thought, he reaches the rather portentous conclusion, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This scheme for a logically foolproof language, a perfect instrument for meaningful assertion, seemed to represent a kind of terminus. And Wittgenstein now turned away from philosophy to find another vocation. He gave away the money he had inherited and lived a simple ascetic life, working as an elementary school teacher in Austrian country districts from 1920 to 26, a gardener's assistant in a monastery, and an amateur architect and builder commissioned by one of his sisters. In the late 1920s, he was sought out by various philosophers who had found inspiration in the Tractatus, particularly Schlick and the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, and he revived his philosophical interests and returned to Cambridge in 1929, first as a research fellow of Trinity College and then as professor of philosophy from 1939 to 47, interrupted only by a period of war service as a porter at Guy's Hospital, London, and a lab assistant at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. He became a naturalized British subject in 1938. At Cambridge, his philosophy began to take a quite new direction, and he attracted a group of devoted pupils. And through his lectures and the circulation of his students' notes, he came to exert a powerful influence on philosophy throughout the English-speaking world. The work of this second period of his philosophical career is best summarized in the posthumous Philosophical Investigations in 1953, a discursive and often enigmatic work which rejects most of the assumptions and conclusions of the Tractatus. In the Investigations, Wittgenstein no longer tries to reduce language to a perfect logical model, but rather points to the variety, open-endedness, and subtlety of everyday language, and explores the actual communicative and social functions of different modes of speech or language games. Language is seen as a toolkit, not a calculus. Philosophy then becomes a therapeutic technique of assembling reminders of usage, which reveal the source of many philosophical paradoxes in the misunderstanding of ordinary language and the obsessive search for unity or simplicity where none exists. Instead of expecting each concept to have a single defining essence, we should rather look for a range of overlapping family resemblances. Wittgenstein died of cancer in Cambridge, and there have been a continuous stream of posthumously edited publications from his prolific notebooks and manuscripts, including Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, 1956, the Blue and Brown Books, 1958, Philosophical Remarks, 1964, and On Certainty, 1969. It's August of 1911. There's a knock at the door. Russell wrote, quote, "An unknown German appeared, speaking very little English but refusing to speak German. He had acquired by himself a passion for the philosophy of mathematics and has now come to Cambridge on purpose to hear me." Quote, though not enrolled at Cambridge, Ludwig attends Russell's lectures, dominates the discussions, then follows Russell to his rooms to argue more. During the Michaelmas vacation of 1911, Ludwig writes a manuscript that impresses Russell greatly. Russell becomes his mentor, his friend, his guide in the social circles of the Cambridge elite. Wittgenstein soon learns all Russell has to teach. Russell wrote, quote, "I love him and feel he will solve the problems I am too old to solve. He is the young man one hopes for. I find him strangely exciting." Quote. Russell grooms Wittgenstein as his successor. When Hermine Wittgenstein, Ludwig's sister, visits Cambridge in 1912, Russell tells her, quote, "We expect the next big step in philosophy to be taken by your brother," quote. But Russell worries that Wittgenstein is pushing himself too hard, always questioning, arguing, wrestling with the invisible shape of thought. Wittgenstein seems on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Russell wrote, quote, "He suddenly stood still and explained that the way we had spent the afternoon was so vile that we ought not to live, or at least he ought not, that nothing is tolerable except producing great works or enjoying those of others, that he has accomplished nothing and never will. All this with a force that knocks one down," quote. In the village of Trottenbuch, where Ludwig takes his first elementary school teaching post, he is most often remembered in the way Frau B tells it, quote, I was in the office when the steam engine went dead and the factory had to stand idle. And then a lot of engineers came who couldn't get the engine to go. Back at home, I told my husband what had happened, and my husband then told the story in the school office. And the teacher, Wittgenstein, said to him, "Could I see it? Could you obtain permission for me to take a look at it?" Then my husband spoke to the director, who said yes, he could come straight away. So then he came with my husband and went straight down to the engine room and began walking around, saying nothing, just looking around. And then he said, "Can I have 4 men?" The director said yes, and 4 came, 2 locksmiths and 2 others. Each had to take a hammer, and then Wittgenstein gave each of the men a number in a different place. As he called, they had to hammer their particular spot in sequence. 1, 4, 3, 2. In this way, they cured the machine of its fault. Quote, "For this, Wittgenstein is rewarded with new linen. He first refuses to take it, then accepts on behalf of the poorer children in his school. But the villagers already have names for him, such as Weird or Rich Baron. Among themselves, they ask, why does a man of wealth and culture choose to live among the poor?" The professor of inductive sciences, Maurice Schlick, coaxes Wittgenstein, the prickly philosopher, to attend Monday discussions with himself, Carnap, Weissman, and Feigl. But Wittgenstein often won't discuss the positivist philosophical ideas the others espouse. He turns his back on them and reads poetry. Carnap said, quote, "His point of view toward people and problems was much more similar to a creative artist than a scientist. When finally, sometimes after a prolonged, arduous effort, his answer came forth, his statement stood before us like a newly created piece of art or a divine revelation," quote. In March of 1928, Wittgenstein goes to a lecture by the intuitionist mathematician Brouwer. Brouwer, the anti-rationalist, claims that mathematics is only a construction of the human mind and that theorems which cannot be proved must be cast aside. Wittgenstein is transformed. Feigl says, quote, "He became extremely voluble and began sketching ideas that were the beginnings of his later writings. That evening marked the return of Wittgenstein to strong philosophical interest and activities," quote. By 1928, to bring him into the academic fold, Wittgenstein needs a doctorate and a stipend. He applies for a college grant, which many support. Frank Ramsey says, quote, "He's a philosophic genius of a different order from anyone else I know," quote. Ludwig is awarded a PhD for his thesis, the already published Tractatus. Moore and Russell give the oral examination in June of 1928. After a short, inconclusive discussion of his book, Wittgenstein brings the proceedings to a close by standing and patting them each on the shoulder, saying, quote, "Don't worry, I know you'll never understand it," quote. With their approval, Wittgenstein receives the PhD and a grant of £100 from Trinity College. He gives his first college lecture on January 20th, 1930, the day after young Frank Ramsey dies. Wittgenstein teaches a course simply called philosophy in his own rooms at Whewell's Court. Students attend by invitation only, invited by professors who think they have promise. The course is not listed because the demand would be too great, given his reputation since the Tractatus. G.E. Moore sits there in an armchair taking notes. Ray Monk wrote that Ludwig, quote, lectured without notes and often appeared to be simply standing in front of his audience, thinking aloud. Occasionally he would stop, saying, just a minute, let me think, and sit down for a few minutes, staring at his upturned hand. Wittgenstein's biographer, Ray Monk, said, quote, he had penetrated beyond the cloudiness and the mystique of philosophy and discovered that behind it lies nothing. Philosophy can't be transformed into a science because it has nothing to find out. Its puzzles are the consequence of a misuse, a misunderstanding of grammar, and require not solution but dissolution. And the method for dissolving these problems consists not in constructing new theories, but in assembling reminders of the things we already know, quote. Wittgenstein said, quote, we never arrive at fundamental propositions in the course of our investigation. We get to the boundary of language, which stops us from asking further questions.